there's a kind of pressure no one prepares you for. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, the kind that shows up quietly and stays. It doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten, it just sits there, pressing down on your chest, day after day, until even breathing feels like a decision. Have you ever noticed that when pressure lasts long enough, fear changes shape? At first, fear begs, then it argues, then it panics, and then, if it isn't relieved, it does something far more dangerous. It goes silent. That silence is where Miyamoto Musashi lived, not for a moment, not for a single fight, for years. People imagine pressure as something explosive, like a final exam, a public failure, a life or death moment that arrives suddenly and then passes. But Musashi's pressure didn't pass. It accumulated. Every duel he walked toward carried the same unspoken rule. Lose once, and your story ends. No reset, no redemption arc, no learning experience, just death. And when a human mind understands that deeply, when it stops hoping the danger will go away, it begins to rewire itself. Musashi didn't wake up one morning confident. He didn't discover discipline through motivation. What happened was far more unsettling. He learned that emotions are a luxury under constant threat, that hesitation is expensive, that pride is heavy, that comfort dulls perception. Under pressure like that, you don't become brave, you become precise. Think about this. What happens when pressure no longer feels temporary? When there's no after this, things calm down. When the danger becomes normal. Most people collapse. Some distract themselves, some numb out, some cling to rules, rituals, or gods to feel safe again. Musashi did none of that. Instead, something in him snapped, not violently but cleanly, like a rope being cut. He stopped negotiating with reality. He stopped expecting fairness. He stopped asking, what if? And once that question disappeared, so did most people's power over him. His enemies mistook his stillness for arrogance, his silence for confidence, his odd behavior for madness. They didn't realize they were looking at someone who had already accepted the worst outcome, and therefore wasn't controlled by it anymore. Pressure didn't make Musashi stronger. It made him unattached, unattached to outcome, unattached to reputation, unattached to survival itself. And when a man reaches that point, something frightening happens. He stops reacting to the world as it is expected to behave. He begins moving according to what is, not what should be. This is why his opponents felt unsettled before blades ever crossed. This is why his presence felt wrong. They sensed it, even if they couldn't name it. Musashi wasn't calm because he trusted himself. He was calm because he had learned how to function after the mind gives up trying to feel safe. And the method he developed under that pressure, the subtle, brutal, psychological shift that followed, is the reason he became untouchable. But none of that was visible at the beginning. All anyone could see was the effect, the stillness, the unpredictability, the absence of fear where fear should have lived. And that's what made people lean forward, wondering, what happened to this man before he ever picked up a sword? Before anyone knew his name, they noticed the way he arrived. Not early, not late, just suddenly there. No announcement, no attempt to impress. He didn't warm up like the others, didn't stretch, didn't pace or rehearse movements under his breath. He stood still, too still. Observers would later say the same thing in different words. It felt like he had already been here long before we noticed him. That was the first thing. The second thing was stranger. Musashi didn't behave like someone who was preparing to win. He behaved like someone who had already lost and adjusted accordingly. No visible tension, no emotional spikes, no outward hunger for victory. When challenged, he didn't respond with excitement or offense. He responded with something closer to assessment. As if the duel wasn't a personal confrontation but a problem to be solved. This unsettled people. In a culture where honor, posture, and ritual mattered deeply, Musashi violated expectations without openly defying them. He showed up unkempt, sometimes late, sometimes quiet when speech was expected, not in rebellion, in indifference. And indifference under pressure is terrifying. Those who crossed him described the same feeling before the fight, a sense that something was missing, not skill, not intelligence, but self-consciousness. It was as if Musashi wasn't performing an identity. He wasn't trying to be the warrior. He wasn't protecting an image, which raised an unspoken question in the minds of his opponents. What kind of man doesn't need to prove anything when death is on the line? The effect of this mindset showed itself in small, almost invisible ways. He didn't rush when others expected aggression. He didn't retreat when retreat made sense. He waited, not passively but attentively, like someone listening for something only he could hear. And when he moved, it wasn't fueled by emotion. There was no anger behind it, no desperation. Just timing. Clean, decisive, unapologetic. Afterward, witnesses struggled to describe what they had seen. Some said he fought like an animal. Others said like a monk. Some claimed madness. None of them agreed except on one thing. Fighting Musashi didn't feel like fighting a man. It felt like colliding with a process, as if the outcome had already been determined and they had simply stepped into it. This is the effect. This is what people saw. But effects don't exist without causes, and behaviors like this don't come from confidence alone. They come from adaptation. From a mind that has been forced again and again into conditions where normal psychology stops working. The truth is, people who grow up safe don't think this way. People who believe in fairness don't move this way. People who expect tomorrow don't detach from today so completely. Something had already taught Musashi that pressure doesn't negotiate, that fear doesn't listen, that hesitation doesn't forgive. And instead of breaking him outwardly, it drove him inward, toward a colder, sharper understanding of how reality actually functions under threat. At this stage, no one knew why he was like this. They only knew the pattern. Those who relied on speed lost. Those who relied on strength lost. Those who relied on technique lost. Because Musashi wasn't playing their game. He had learned to operate after the usual mental frameworks had collapsed. And whatever pressure had taught him that, it hadn't been brief. It hadn't been merciful. It had been prolonged enough to rewrite him. The cause was still hidden, but its fingerprints were everywhere. To understand the kind of pressure Musashi lived under, you have to first understand the world he was moving through. This was not a time that rewarded hesitation. Japan in Musashi's era was a place where uncertainty ruled everything. Alliances shifted overnight. Schools of swordsmanship competed not just for honor but for survival. Reputation wasn't social currency. It was armor. Lose it, and you became vulnerable. Lose a duel and you vanished from history entirely. Every challenge was final, every mistake permanent. And Musashi walked directly into this environment without insulation. No powerful clan shielding him. No safety net of status, no guarantee that skill alone would save him. Pressure didn't spike occasionally. It surrounded him. From the moment he began walking the path of the sword, he was living inside a system designed to expose weakness, publicly and fatally. But the real pressure wasn't just external. It was psychological. Each duel didn't just test technique. It tested identity. If you lost, it didn't mean you had a bad day, and it meant you were wrong about who you thought you were. Most people cannot survive that kind of repeated judgment. That's why they cling to structure, to forms, to traditions, to predictable rhythms. Structure creates the illusion of control. Musashi slowly stripped himself of it, not all at once, not consciously at first. It began with small decisions that looked careless to outsiders. He stopped dressing like a warrior was supposed to dress. He stopped announcing himself the way etiquette demanded. He stopped syncing his behavior to expectations. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of adaptation. Because under real pressure, every unnecessary habit becomes a liability. Every ritual costs time. Every performance drains attention. Every concern for appearance splits focus. And focus under threat is life. What people didn't see was how carefully Musashi was paying attention, not to swords alone, but to people, to the way tension showed in shoulders, to how confidence cracked under silence, to how anticipation made movements predictable. While others trained to perfect form, Musashi trained to observe collapse. He noticed how men behaved right before fear overtook them, how they sped up when they should slow down, how they committed too early, how they mistook aggression for control. And all of this learning happened under one condition. If he misread even once, he would die. This is important. Pressure that teaches gently produces knowledge. Pressure that threatens survival produces instinct. Musashi's mind wasn't storing techniques. It was calibrating itself, slowly, relentlessly. Each encounter added another layer of understanding, not about swordsmanship, but about human behavior under strain. And as this understanding grew, something subtle shifted inside him. He stopped needing reassurance, stopped seeking confirmation, stopped checking himself against others. Because when you live long enough in an environment where outcomes are immediate and unforgiving, external validation becomes meaningless. Only accuracy matters. The world began to feel simpler to him, not easier but clearer. Cause and effect sharpened, noise fell away. And while others felt pressure as chaos, Musashi began to experience it as information. This is the point most people miss. Pressure didn't make Musashi reckless. It made him selective. Selective about when to move. Selective about when to wait. Selective about what mattered at all. By now, his presence alone was changing rooms. Conversations stalled when he entered. Eyes tracked him without intention. Opponents felt exposed before the first exchange, not because he dominated the space, but because he didn't participate in it the way others did. Pressure had already stripped him down to essentials, and in doing so, it was preparing him for something deeper, something darker. Something that would soon force a complete internal shift, one that even Musashi himself didn't fully understand at the time. The slow build was almost complete. The environment had done its work. Now it would demand a price. There were small things about Musashi that nobody could explain. He would sometimes disappear for days without reason, not traveling, not training openly, just gone. When he returned, he wasn't exhausted, he wasn't wandering, he was different, quieter, stranger, more precise. People noticed the change in him immediately but didn't ask. Most were too nervous to. Another thing, he rarely spoke unless necessary. When he did, his words had weight, not weight of authority, weight of inevitability. Some reported that he seemed to anticipate questions before they were asked. Others swore he moved objects with intention before they even reached for them, not by magic, not by sleight, but by something subtler. One observer recalled him sitting in the corner of a crowded dojo. The room was alive with chatter, swords clanging, and tension mounting. Everyone noticed the same thing. Musashi wasn't listening to the noise. He wasn't watching the students. He was somewhere else. He was calculating possibilities invisible to the rest of the world. And then there were his habits during duels. Sometimes he would tilt his head slightly, almost imperceptibly before the first exchange. Opponents called it arrogance. Veterans called it madness. What it really was, no one knew. A silent reading of the human soul. Another small detail. He never celebrated victories. He didn't bow. He didn't acknowledge applause. He didn't gloat. He simply walked away. People who tried to follow him afterward noticed something unsettling. The air felt different where he had been. Not charged, not mystical, just empty in a way that made you aware of your own mortality. Even his closest companions admitted they didn't truly know him, not fully. And the more time they spent around him, the more they felt something unspoken, something sharp and unavoidable lingering beneath his stillness. Each of these moments was a breadcrumb, a subtle signal that Musashi wasn't just skilled, he was something other, something shaped entirely by extremes no one else could endure, and all of it left a single gnawing question. What had he been through to become like this? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't something a story could immediately explain. It was hidden in pressure, in isolation, in decisions that no one watching could comprehend. And yet those crumbs kept piling up. Every odd glance, every silent pause, every invisible anticipation was a puzzle piece. Each one whispered, something happened here, something that created this unstoppable presence. And slowly, without realizing it, people began to fear the unseen forces shaping him, even more than the sword in his hand. All the precision, all the stillness, all the uncanny anticipation, none of it came without a cost. No one ever talked about it, and even his closest observers could only guess. Musashi carried something invisible, something heavier than any sword, into every duel. The weight of inevitable loss. Every step he took, every motion he made was calculated not to impress or dominate. It was calculated to survive. And survival wasn't just about skill. It was about anticipating all the ways things could go wrong and preparing for them before they happened. At first glance, this made him seem untouchable, calm, almost preternatural. But the truth was far darker. Musashi's mind was a battlefield long before his body ever saw one, long before the clashing of swords, before the strikes and parries, before the roar of spectators or the tension of his opponents. There was a quieter, more relentless war. Inside himself, he awoke every day knowing that a single mistake could be fatal. And this wasn't hypothetical. This wasn't the luxury of losing and learning. This was real, immediate, final. Most people cannot endure that kind of psychological strain without breaking. Some seek comfort in ritual, in faith, in companions. Some distract themselves with vanity or overconfidence. Others numb themselves entirely. Musashi had none of these options. He couldn't hide behind training or tradition. He couldn't rely on chance or luck. He couldn't postpone the consequences for tomorrow. Tomorrow didn't exist. There was only this duel, this moment, this calculation. And that is what made him terrifying to his contemporaries. They watched a man who seemed almost detached from fear itself. But that detachment wasn't born of courage. It was born of a relentless confrontation with fear so constant it became invisible. The first layer of this twist is subtle. He didn't just train his body, he trained his mind. But not in the way most warriors train. He trained his perception, his awareness, his ability to remain awake to every movement, every glance, every subtle shift in the environment or in his opponent's posture. This was an internal crucible that demanded total attention, total energy, total surrender of what most people call normal life. He didn't think in terms of victories or losses. He thought in probabilities, in reactions, in what must happen for survival. And the second layer is even heavier. Emotional detachment. Every bond, every friendship, every attachment had the potential to distract him. A single distraction could cost his life. Over time, he began to withdraw, not out of cruelty, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. He learned to protect nothing in the material world, in relationships, or even in self-concept. Some scholars might call this stoicism, some might call it madness. But it was neither. It was adaptation to extremity. The cost, however, was isolation. Deep, profound isolation. Musashi was surrounded by people, but he had been taught, through the pressure of survival, that he could rely on no one. He could not share his fear, he could not expose his hesitation, and if he allowed himself to hope, the world could take that hope in an instant. The third layer, exhaustion, the kind that never shows. It is easy to imagine a warrior walking into battle as energetic, fiery, motivated. Musashi did not have energy in that sense. He had endurance, the kind built from years of psychological tension so extreme that it reshaped the nervous system itself. He didn't feel adrenaline or anger. He felt function. Function as a way of life. Function as a survival mechanism honed over decades. This is the emotional twist in full. The man who seemed invincible was not fearless. He was carrying the weight of every possible failure, every possible death, and had transformed that weight into a tool. And there is a fourth, more subtle truth. Musashi's mind was always in motion. He anticipated not only his opponent's movements, but also the collapse of their mental state under pressure. He saw patterns in panic. He understood timing and hesitation. He read micro-expressions that revealed intent before action. And he did all of this while simultaneously monitoring his own reactions, adjusting instinctively, and suppressing any signal of emotion that could betray weakness. Every duel, every encounter became an exercise in absolute mental discipline, not just swordsmanship. He had to maintain this level of focus not for minutes, but for hours, days, and years. And that kind of strain changes a person. It erodes the self. It strips away illusions. It leaves only the essential core: awareness, calculation, and adaptation. The fifth layer, the inevitability of solitude, became almost a companion. He could not share this experience. No one could understand the pressure he lived under without living it themselves. Even allies, even students, even family, none of them were trained for this. The solitude was both protective and corrosive. It kept him alive, and it ate at the edges of his humanity. And yet, out of this crushing, lonely, endless tension, Musashi became unstoppable. Not because he was fearless, not because he was lucky, not because he was a prodigy. He became unstoppable because he redefined fear, pressure, and survival as tools rather than obstacles. He turned every moment of potential death into a learning opportunity. He turned every failure into instinct. He turned every isolation into clarity. And that is the real emotional twist. The brilliance, the calm, the untouchable presence that history remembers wasn't an absence of fear. It was a transformation of fear into a constant, usable force. Most people never experience this. Most people crumble under pressure. Most people cling to hope, to guidance, to comfort. Musashi didn't. He lived inside the storm until the storm became part of him, and anyone standing across from him, anyone who faced him in that intimate crucible of a duel, could feel the effect without knowing why. They weren't just facing a sword. They were facing a mind that had already survived everything the world could throw at it, and more. By the time the fight began, the battle was already over. Musashi had already conquered the internal wars no one else could endure, and that is the haunting truth. To become unstoppable, he didn't train only the body. He surrendered, endured, and reshaped his mind under extreme pressure, until fear, hesitation, and doubt became not weaknesses but instruments. And anyone who underestimated the cost he paid and the psychological transformation it created was doomed from the first strike. By now, it wasn't just a duel. It was every duel he had ever fought, compressed into this single moment. Musashi's enemies thought they were preparing for combat. He was preparing for everything that could possibly happen before, during, and after the combat, all at once. The tension he carried wasn't external. It didn't rise with the clash of swords or the cheers of the crowd. It lived inside him, a constant hum that sharpened his senses, stretched his perception, and twisted his reality into something almost alien. Each heartbeat was measured, Each breath was accounted for, each glance, each twitch of muscle, each subtle shift of weight. Everything was analyzed and predicted, not in minutes but in microseconds. And yet he did this without any outward signs. To an observer, Musashi could appear calm, even lazy, almost bored, but inside his mind was running infinite simulations, looping probabilities, anticipating failures, and calculating contingencies with terrifying precision. It was the kind of thinking that would crush a normal mind. A normal mind would be paralyzed by the sheer number of possibilities. A normal mind would fracture under the pressure of anticipating threats that had not yet arrived. A normal mind would be consumed by doubt, hesitation, or fear. Musashi's mind, however, had been forged under extreme conditions. Every moment of his life, every duel, every brush with death had been mental conditioning on a level most people cannot comprehend. He didn't just react to the world. He anticipated it, reshaped it, and positioned himself where reactions weren't even necessary. And here's where the tension rises further. This method demanded constant vigilance every second of every day. There was no break. There was no downtime. There was no retreat. Even when he ate, even when he slept, even when he was alone, his mind remained on the battlefield. He analyzed his own habits. He monitored his own emotions. He examined his own weaknesses. Because weakness, even internal, was dangerous. He couldn't afford overconfidence. He couldn't afford distraction. He couldn't afford humanity itself, not in the conventional sense. This is why Musashi seemed almost inhuman, not because he lacked feeling, not because he was cruel, but because his mind had been sharpened to a level where ordinary emotions could no longer operate without distortion. And with every duel, every encounter, every misstep he avoided, that sharpening intensified. The more extreme the threat, the more his mind adapted. The more impossible the situation, the more clarity he gained. And the terrifying truth for his opponents was this: they were fighting a man who had already survived every possible failure he could imagine, and then some. Every hesitation they displayed, every twitch of nervousness, every fleeting doubt, Musashi saw it, anticipated it, exploited it. And the longer the fight went on, the more the psychological pressure compounded. Not just on Musashi, on his opponents. Every strike, every feint, every pause became a test of mental endurance. They weren't just dueling swords, they were dueling a mind that thrived under impossibility. And the brilliance of Musashi's method is that he never needed to force the fight. He didn't need brute speed. He didn't need overwhelming strength. He didn't need flashy technique. All he needed was the psychological upper hand. Because humans are fragile creatures. Fear clouds judgment. Panic fractures decisions. Expectation blinds perception. Musashi didn't need to strike first. He didn't need to attack. He only needed to be present. And the tension, the relentless pressure of his presence, the invisible weight of his internal preparation was enough to destabilize anyone. Each duel, each encounter, each life or death test became a cycle. Pressure to observation, to anticipation, to reaction, to adaptation, to pressure again. And every time Musashi grew sharper, faster, more precise. While others felt the weight of survival as fear, he felt it as data. While others fractured under pressure, he felt it as fuel. While others experienced doubt, he felt it as clarity. But the tension didn't stop at his enemies, it extended to himself. Because constant pressure is a double-edged sword. It refines the mind, but it also erodes it. There was no true rest for Musashi, no mental pause, no surrender to fatigue. Every misstep, every emotional lapse, every failure to read an opponent fully could have ended him. And so he learned to detach from outcomes entirely. Not in a philosophical sense, not as a theory, as a practical necessity. Every fight, every challenge, every duel was a simulation in inevitability. Every moment was a rehearsal of the worst-case scenario. Every breath, every glance, every subtle motion was a rehearsal of survival. And in that crucible, something extraordinary emerged. Musashi became unstoppable. Not because he was invincible, not because he could control the world, not because he was lucky, because he had learned to convert unbearable pressure into absolute clarity. Where most minds broke, his mind calculated. Where most bodies faltered, his body executed. Where most warriors feared, his presence imposed. And the final escalation is this. The psychological tension was additive. Each duel layered upon the last. Each confrontation stacked upon the previous trauma. Each near death, each betrayal, each moment of isolation added to the precision of his mind and the inevitability of his mastery. It was relentless. It was merciless. It was perfection under pressure so extreme most people would shatter immediately. And that is the terrifying core of Musashi's genius. The same pressure that would destroy anyone else refined him, sharpened him, and made him a force beyond understanding. He didn't merely survive extreme pressure, he thrived because of it. And that is the point where ordinary understanding fails, because no one watching could truly grasp the internal war that created the calm, the precision, the untouchable presence. Every opponent, every observer, every chronicler saw only the effect. They did not see the mental crucible, the relentless tension, the constant, unbearable weight of reality pressed against a single human mind. And yet it is precisely this invisible struggle that made Musashi unstoppable. There comes a moment, though it is invisible to anyone watching, when a man under extreme pressure stops asking questions. Musashi reached that moment not on the battlefield, but in the empty space inside himself. He had trained, fought, and survived countless duels. He had studied his opponents, studied himself, studied fear, hesitation, and failure. He had walked through moments when death was imminent and survived because he had learned to anticipate it, to measure it, to internalize it. And yet, even after all of this, there came a singular realization, a moment that is impossible to describe fully because it is not a feeling. It is a collapse of everything that was previously thought necessary. In that instant, Musashi understood something almost horrifyingly simple. All the fear, all the hesitation, all the effort, all the preparation, none of it mattered outside the clarity of the present moment. The past was gone. The future was irrelevant. There was only this, and the mind that could navigate it. And navigating it was not about aggression, not about mastery, not even about survival. It was about presence. The paradox was striking. The more he had endured, the more detached he had become. The more he had prepared for death, the more he understood life, not as an experience to be clung to, but as a process to be executed with precision and awareness. He realized that the stories of his duels, the legends that would later grow around his name, were meaningless in comparison to the internal work that had made him unstoppable. Every moment of fear endured, every betrayal anticipated, every ounce of isolation absorbed had one purpose: to make him independent of circumstance. Most warriors fight because they hope for victory. Musashi did not fight because he hoped. He fought because hope is a liability, because reliance on luck, on timing, on the behavior of others is a chain. Chains are fatal. The emotional peak emerges in this clarity. He understood that true mastery is not about conquering others. It is about conquering the mind itself. And this is where the story turns almost philosophical. He had endured pressure so extreme, so unrelenting, that it had erased the ordinary self. Not the skill, not the technique, not the memory, but the ego, the attachments, the unnecessary emotions. They fell away one by one until nothing remained but what was essential. And the essential is terrifying in its simplicity. Observation, calculation, execution, everything else is noise. Musashi saw it now fully. He did not need to dominate to be unstoppable. He did not need to impress to be feared. He did not need allies to survive. All he needed was himself and the unflinching understanding of reality under pressure. And in that understanding came another revelation, deeper and darker than anyone watching could imagine. The world itself is indifferent. Life and death are indifferent. Honor is indifferent. The expectations of men, the approval of society, even the threat of death. They are all indifferent. The only meaningful force is the mind that can see clearly, act decisively, and endure without flinching. And Musashi had become that force. The peak is subtle, but it is overwhelming. He understood that the unstoppable is not born from power or luck, but from acceptance of reality in its most brutal form. The fear that once gripped him, the uncertainty that once tortured him, the constant threat of failure, all of it had been transformed. Fear was no longer a master, it was a tool. Doubt was no longer a barrier, it was information. Pressure was no longer unbearable, it was fuel. In that realization, the internal climax unfolds fully. Musashi became aware that he was free. Not free in the way most people think. Not free in comfort, in companionship, or in hope. Free in a way that terrifies the ordinary mind. He was free from expectation, free from hesitation, free from the illusions of safety, free from the need to be understood. He had endured everything a man could endure and had done so in a way that made survival inevitable. And yet even in this freedom there was no joy, no relief, no triumph. The emotional weight was still present, but now it was purposeful. The calm was not peace. The stillness was not idle. The mastery was not arrogance. It was the quiet perfection of a mind honed by pressure to the edge of human possibility. And here is the haunting element. Anyone observing this man would feel the effect without knowing why. His opponents, his peers, even casual onlookers, sensed something unnatural. It was not his sword alone. It was the mental presence of a human mind that had become a weapon through the crucible of extreme pressure. Musashi had become unstoppable because he had endured, internalized, and transformed every possible threat, physical, psychological, and emotional, into a single coherent state of being. He had learned that fear is not the enemy. Hesitation is not the enemy. Death itself is not the enemy. The enemy is ignorance, distraction, and the illusion that life can be controlled by anything other than clarity and decisive action. And Musashi had no illusions left. He had been stripped bare, tested, and forged by pressure. And from that crucible emerged a man who moved through the world as if it were predictable, but only because he had trained himself to perceive all variables, anticipate all outcomes, and survive regardless of circumstance. This is the psychological apex. Musashi's unstoppability was not skill alone, not strategy alone, not courage alone. It was the absolute terrifying clarity of a mind that had survived everything, anticipated everything, and accepted everything, without flinching, without hope, without hesitation. And in that realization there was no triumph, no pride, no story. Only the quiet knowledge of what it truly means to endure, to adapt, and to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. And anyone who has ever faced their own fear in its purest form, the pressure that crushes, isolates, and strips away everything but focus, can feel the weight of this realization. Because it is not a story about victory. It is a story about the unbearable, transformative weight of pressure itself, and the strange liberation that comes from mastering it. Musashi's calm, his silence, his presence, his precision, all of it flows from this singular peak of psychological and emotional understanding. And it is here, in this internal stillness, that the legend of Musashi finds its true origin. Not in the duels he won, not in the lives he touched, not in the fame he accrued, but in the crucible of his own mind, where pressure was absolute and he refused to break. After all the duels, after all the pressure, after all the anticipation, Musashi did not walk away with a sense of triumph in the way most men might imagine. There were no parades, no accolades, no satisfaction from defeating the world's finest swordsman. What remained was quieter. What remained was something heavier, subtler, and far more enduring. He carried with him the knowledge of absolute endurance, the understanding that the human mind is capable of more than anyone imagines, but only when stripped of distraction, attachment, and illusion. He understood that most people never see themselves clearly. Most people measure success by comparison, by reputation, by praise, by the outcomes that others will notice. Musashi did not. He measured himself against a standard that was invisible to everyone else, his ability to endure the extreme, the unbearable, the unrelenting. And in that standard, he was unmatched. The quiet landing comes in recognizing the paradox. The more the world threatened him, the freer he became. The more death and danger surrounded him, the more alive his mind became, not alive in the sense of joy or comfort, but alive in clarity and presence. He had learned to observe without judgment, to act without ego, to survive without hope, and that is the haunting part. To be truly unstoppable is not to conquer others. It is to conquer oneself under conditions that would destroy almost anyone else. Musashi had survived the extreme pressure not because he was luckier, stronger, or inherently gifted. He had survived because he had learned to embrace the unthinkable, to endure what most cannot, and to see reality in its rawest form. And that reality is not comforting. It is indifferent. It is uncompromising. It is relentless. But it is also fair. Because when you stop clinging to illusion, when you stop hoping for reprieve, when you surrender the idea that life should behave kindly, what remains is clarity, precision, and capability beyond measure. Musashi's quiet landing is not in the applause of the crowd, the fear of his enemies, or the stories that would later immortalize his name. It is in the stillness of his mind, the sharpness of his awareness, the freedom that comes from accepting the pressure he cannot escape and turning it into his greatest tool. And perhaps that is the lesson we overlook in our own lives. We fear pressure. We cling to comfort. We avoid risk. We hide from situations that push us to the edge. But pressure is not the enemy. It is the sculptor. It is the lens that sharpens perception. It is the weight that strengthens endurance. Musashi's life is proof that the mind can become unstoppable not by avoiding fear, not by seeking ease, but by embracing the extremes it is forced to endure. Every reader, every observer, every student of life can take something from this. The moments that crush us, isolate us, push us past our known limits. These are the moments that refine us. The fear, the doubt, the exhaustion, the isolation, these are the tools that carve away everything unnecessary, leaving only clarity, focus, and the capacity to act decisively under pressure. And here is the lingering question that stays after the story. If Musashi could endure years of life and death pressure and emerge unstoppable, what could you endure? What would happen if you faced your own fears without flinching, without hope, without clinging to safety and used them as fuel rather than barriers? Musashi did not need luck. He did not need guidance. He did not need anyone to validate his existence. He needed only to see clearly, to act decisively, and to endure relentlessly. And that is the quiet, haunting truth of his legacy. Unstoppability is not a gift. It is forged in the furnace of extreme pressure, one thought, one breath, one relentless decision at a time. The calm after the storm is not relief. It is presence. It is awareness. It is the strange, quiet power of a mind that has learned to survive the unbearable and emerge transformed, precise, and utterly unstoppable. And now, as the echoes of his duels fade and the world continues oblivious, the lesson lingers. Pressure does not crush the mind that learns to endure it. It does not bind the soul that embraces it. It does not defeat the one who sees it as the only path to clarity and mastery. Musashi's life whispers this truth across centuries. The extreme can make you weak, or it can make you unstoppable. The choice begins and ends within the crucible of your own mind.